Evening, everyone. Welcome to the third day of the Summer Institute, hosted by the Atkinson Center and George Brown College. I'm going to be your moderator this evening, but before we start, I'm going to ask my colleague to play the land acknowledgement.
Acknowledging land is something Indigenous people have been practicing for generations, long before settlers arrived. Recognizing the land you are on is an expression of respect and gratitude. OPSEU Local 557 would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat, which is now home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We also acknowledge that Toronto is a treaty territory, a relationship between the Mississaugas of the Credit and Canada. This land is also part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the land. Other Indigenous people, settlers, and newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. This means we are all treaty people. As such, it is our responsibility to honor and respect this land and express gratitude for the opportunity to work on and share this land. All my relations. All my relations basically translates to we're all related. It's a reminder that everything in the universe is part of a single whole and is connected in some way to everything else. This means everything and everyone are our relatives, and that they have a purpose and are worthy of respect and care, especially the land and each other. Thank you, Miigwech, Walaliuk, all my relations.
Thank you for that. While that land acknowledgement was acknowledging the fact that George Brown and Atkinson Center both reside in the City of Toronto, I'm going to invite you to pause, reflect, and to acknowledge the spaces where you're located. I know that we have people from across Canada and elsewhere, so to take a moment and to honor and respect the land for where you're gathering. So I'm Bernice Ciproni McLeod. I'm a professor at George Brown College and part of the Atkinson Center team. And as I said earlier, it's my pleasure to be your moderator this evening. I'd like to introduce our panelists who are going to take us through a lively conversation, I hope, and discussion presentation related to workforce issues. So we have Armine Yalnizyan and Kerry McCuaig and Alana Powell. They'll tell a little bit more about themselves as they present to you this evening. So I'm going to remind you to please use the Q&A. We're going to try to respond to as many questions as possible. We're not using the chat function this evening. Again, we will though collect your voices, your concerns, hear your thoughts through the Q&A. After each panelist presents for approximately 12 minutes is when we'll go back to those questions and engage in some discussion amongst the panelists. And I think that's all the housekeeping I need to do for this evening. So I'm going to ask that we begin with you, Armine.
Thank you, Bernice. It is such a pleasure to be with all of you this evening and also to be able to share this presentation. Do you know, I'm not going to be able to do this fast, am I? Yes, I am. Here we go. I'm speaking to you from the banks of the Ottawa River, and every day I watch the world go by and think about what my place in that world is. We're all just passing through. But the work we do while we're here is, and how we treat one another while we're here, is critical to the world we create. And women's work has a specific meaning in this first ever global She session as we move through a period of time where we are told we are going to start treating the incredibly important work of raising our youngest learners and bringing them into the world as full humans that can do all the things that that land acknowledgement talked about. In particular, treating one another with respect, treating all relations with respect. So what I'm going to say in my few minutes with you is, no, the She session isn't over. And no, there will be no recovery without a she-covery, and there can't be a she-covery without childcare. Yes, we don't have enough high quality early learning and childcare. So what could that $30 billion that was put aside in the federal budget just a few weeks ago buy? And finally, the role of the care economy, which has been revealed during the pandemic, but will be absolutely foundational to what happens next post-pandemic. So let me go through these first few slides pretty quickly. There's a cottage industry that has blown up in the last few weeks of white men saying that if there was ever a she session, it is by far over. And why are we spending any money on childcare? Because after all, the recovery is almost upon us. So as of the latest data, on Friday we will get new data, but as of the latest data, which is up to the middle of April 2021, almost 2/3 of all the jobs that have been lost in this recession were lost by women, most of whom were low-paid and racialized workers. And perhaps a more telling statistic is that for the 61,000 women that have just given up and dropped out of the labor force, they are neither working nor looking for work. 53,000 more men joined the labor force in the same period. And that is this chart that I'm showing you is a chart that I created for Maclean's magazine a while back. Yeah, you guys can see past that your screen sharing thing, right? You can see it fine? Okay, I'm not getting any feedback, so I'm assuming it's fine. But anyway, on Friday, I will update this chart, but in every metric that we can use to say, how have women been impacted in the labor market? And they've been impacted worse than men. And the reason why that average weekly hours actually worked is higher for women than men is because women lost so many low-paid jobs. You will notice that women lost way more part-time work than men did. Men actually picked up some part-time work. That means that with fewer women working part-time, a bigger share of those women working full-time, they're working longer hours on average. Are you guys following me? Great. I just screwed that up entirely. No, I didn't. Oh, I don't even know what my slides are, sorry. So the biggest hit to workers in this recession was to young workers, and particularly young female workers, which is a little bit unusual that it's more skewed towards women. But amongst prime age workers, it was parents of preschoolers that were hardest hit, especially the moms. That's your upper left-hand corner. And you will see that they were below 0. They still haven't regained where they are, and they're far further. The red line is women, the blue line is men. So parents were actually doing pretty good after the recession for 6 to 12-year-olds, for 13 to 17-year-old parents, and people without kids didn't do as well. But the people that did the worst was parents with children under the age of 5, preschoolers. And you know, we've been saying that the she session is over. Well, we have rolled back the clock on how women were doing so far. I put these two charts together to show you what has been happening since 1976 to women's employment rate. This is annual rates, and you will see that over time, more women have been working. It kind of plateaued after the global financial crisis in 2008, which was the peak. It kind of plateaued out there and then took a bad beating during the pandemic. For men, it isn't a reversal of long-term trends. This is a long-term trend that fewer men have been working as a share of all men aged 15 and over. And that's largely because so many men are able to retire now that weren't able to retire before, but also more young men getting post-secondary education. And so we've seen a long-term decline and a hit taken for sure, but it isn't the same storyline as what was happening to women. And let me just show you what that means now, because annual data, rolling up the average for 2020, doesn't mean much because we've had more of a rebound. By April 2021, Canada was back to the level of employment as a percentage of the population for women that we saw in 2000. Alberta was the worst in this pity parade, 1992 levels. Ontario was the second worst, 1997. Manitoba, 1999. When you get to BC, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, you start getting to provinces that weren't as badly affected in 2020 and have done pretty well thus far. But every jurisdiction is looking at women's employment rates that are, you've at least lost a few years of employment rates, which had been kind of consistently growing. So who cares? There's a lot of people out there that are asking, well, so what if some women don't get back to work? Why don't men work more? Well, let me lay it out for you. GDP is driven by household spending. The economy is propelled by household spending. It accounts for 57%, it accounted for 57% of all economic activity before the pandemic hit. Bigger than exports, bigger than business investments, bigger than governments. And the biggest spenders among households are families that have kids under 18. And most of those households, about 2/3 of them, rely on two earners to be able to make up their household income. Women contribute on average 40% of these incomes. So falling out of the labor market, if a significant share of these women are falling out of the labor market because they can't access early learning and childcare, you are creating a drag on GDP recovery. We can't even get back to so-called normal. And the crazy making part of that is it is policy amenable. You could actually do something through policy to fix that. So women's work has been declared by the feminist government of Canada since about 2016 as an opportunity to boost the economy. On the backs of more women working, mostly putting in more hours of work. It certainly is remains the biggest untapped or reserve source of economic growth. And in budget 2021, it said that the impact of actually investing in early learning and childcare was going to add another 250,000 jobs approximately and increase real GDP by a level that significantly outpaced the impact of free trade. So we know that it's going to be a job booster, and we know that because of what happened in Quebec. All of you know what that story is. Quebec went from having less than an average rate of employment for women who were of childbearing ages to an above average rate. In fact, for kids under the age of 3, Quebec is one of the world leaders in terms of employment rates. So childcare can definitely make a difference. And again, in the budget, it was said that the Quebec version of childcare boosted the province's GDP by 1.7%. So how do we get to Quebec? Well, they have better coverage for children aged 0 to 4 and better coverage for kids that are in school by making things more affordable. If we were to get to roughly 60% coverage, which is what they do in Quebec, we would need 358,000 more regulated spaces in the rest of Canada. And based on the ratios that are given to me by people like Kerry, that would be 71,000 more educators. And I don't think childcare ends at school, when you enter kindergarten, but let's say it does. Let's just leave it there, and you can look at the rest of the needs. But to be able to meet our children's needs for care, to make them learning ready when they enter school and learning supported as they go through school, you would need to double the estimated existing spaces outside of Quebec as of 2017. This is a bit of an old slide. And that means about 150,000 more early educators. And that is a 60% growth over what we estimated we had. Is that even doable? Well, yeah, it is doable, because half of Canadians, just technically it's doable. Half of Canadians aged under the age 5 and under live in 7 cities where you can predict poverty by postal codes. You could actually make the biggest difference if you targeted rollout in cities so that you can get to universality, but make sure you don't make the mistakes of Quebec and you actually provide the care where it is needed the most, where there are childcare deserts. You start there and roll out. So what could $30 billion buy? That's the figure that was in the federal budget on April the 21st over 5 years. It doesn't buy perfection and it doesn't buy certainty. On the one hand, we could get more of what we've already got, a fast track of affordability first, but unsure how you expand access. You could address shift worker needs. You could bring in more regulated care, which would mean less reliance on informal and home care, but you would still have a mix of public and private, and within the private sector, a mix of for-profit and not-for-profit. And I know the budget said it was not agnostic, that it would prefer not-for-profit care, but that's, who knows how that's going to translate in the bilateral agreements. The point is that one way of dealing with this $30 billion would heavily rely on expanding markets first. But another approach would be to put quality front and center in everything that we do, that we tackle childcare deserts first and ensure that they are served with high quality care, that we educate down with full day junior and senior kindergarten, that so that we are increasing publicly funded and publicly managed early learning and childcare, that we provide pathways to improving the qualifications of all ECEs, new and existing, and hand in glove with that, improving their wages, their benefits, so that we are reducing turnover and improving quality. Again, a focus on the quality of care first is a very different approach, and it's unclear how these bilats are going to turn out. And I have a bunch of questions at the bottom. Are we going to have a national training strategy? If we're talking about a very large number, a 60% increase in the workforce in the coming years, don't we need a national training strategy? Maybe yes, maybe no. Do we need care standards that are national in scope? Maybe yes, maybe no. Do we need better reporting? Oh, you bet your booties we do. Do we need a federal provincial table as we have for healthcare or finance or infrastructure and other basic needs for Canadians, so that there's a bit of a race to the top sort of mentality and a bit of pressuring provinces and territories that might not be quite on stream to up their game? And I guess I want to raise also from a workforce point of view, what is it that we are building on? Schools are going to come back to full capacity no matter how long they're closed, because education, public education, is a statutory right, and it is publicly, by and large, publicly funded and publicly managed. But ELCC is not publicly funded, publicly managed, or anybody's right. It's largely a market-provided service that has been very vulnerable to pandemic economics, which are lower revenues and higher costs. That means more closures. So we've lost capacity, but we actually don't have any real-time data on how much we've lost. I've turned to people like Alana for guesstimates, where we think that in some markets we've lost between 30 and 50% in some very high impact, some communities that have been highly impacted by COVID. And that's huge. If this was roads or bridges, any other form of infrastructure, you couldn't function and go right, flick a switch and say we're reopening again. So what we're building will depend on how we expand access. And it's super important that we avoid creating a new vector of care like the long-term care facilities, where they are highly reliant on for-profit provision. And for-profit provision, we know, seems to care more for profit than for the care. The care economy is real. It is huge. So here's the reality. It is an economic, we often think about it as like a nice to do. And it's like, oh, isn't that nice that we're caring for one another? It's an economic driver already by just counting the economic transactions of paid care. It accounts for 12.3% of GDP, and that was before the pandemic. It is rivaled the only sector it is rivaled by is real estate, not oil and gas, not manufacturing, nothing else rivals it. And it remains unrivaled as a source of all jobs. And by the care economy, I mean health and welfare and education. So it isn't an afterthought at all. It is the foundation of the essential economy. And it has such amazing potential to unleash human and economic potential if it's not totally market driven. But because it is such an economic driver, there are tons of for-profit activities that will grow as the care economy grows. So we're going to need to be way more vigilant over what we are asking our elected officials to do with our money. Remember, this is our money, not federal money, not provincial money. It's our money that should be buying change. And I agree, conditional funding is tough. Most governments have got an allergy to it. And enforcement and penalties for bad actors is even tougher, but that's exactly the era we need to be moving into because of this. Population aging means a growing care economy. The bright blue line, the bright blue area of this chart is the share of the population that is children. Our fertility rate has been dropping since the 60s. We don't have new people coming into the labor market at the rate we used to have. But the share of people in the grayed out area that is age 65 and older is growing. It's going to be the biggest such cohort we've ever seen in history. And it's not going to last for a few years like a high dependency ratio did during the baby boom years. It's going to go on for 2.5 or 3 decades. We're going to need all hands on deck. Early learning and childcare is part of that. But early learning and childcare is just one part of the growing care economy. So my key message to you is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That is exactly what your grandmother told you. And I think we really need to be investing in the preventive measures that early learning and childcare can bring to us. Thank you for your time. I'm done.
Thank you, Armine. If you could stop sharing your screen and we will move on to the next panelist. Thanks so much. Very informative. I'm struck by the SHE session and some of the messages that you put forth related to the importance of early child education, early learning and care, and the economy. And it's always interesting to hear from an economist who have been in this space for a number of years, really trying to promote early learning and care. I'm going to turn this over to now Alana Powell, who is going to present her knowledge and information with us. Thanks, Alana.
Thanks, Bernice. Just gonna pull up my slideshow there. Should be all set. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and thanks to Atkinson Center and George Brown College for inviting me to be here. I'm always so appreciative to share space with Armine and with Kerry, and I'm always blown away by what Armine is able to share with us, and I know that Kerry's going to bookend me with some wonderful new updates on workforce data, so looking forward to that as well. My name is Alana Powell, as Bernice said. I'm joining today from the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, which is land colonially known as Ottawa. And I also want to acknowledge at the outset of my presentation that as a registered early childhood educator and a settler on this land, I feel a particular responsibility to acknowledge the finding of the mass grave of 215 children on the Kamloops residential school land, and that I've been holding space and really thinking with this and thinking and grieving for those children and for the Kamloops to Secwepemc community. And in particular, as an educator, I feel that we have a unique responsibility to acknowledge the past historical injustices, but also the ongoing colonial injustices that are oppressing Indigenous children and families in our country. So having said that, thank you for giving me space to do that. I'm going to talk today about decent work and Ontario's early childhood workforce. In particular, what I want to bring forward today is sort of an update on where the workforce is at, what are they talking about, what has their experience been like over the last year in particular, how has that increased some of the challenges we know that they experience. And what do we see as the way forward? You'll see on my slide right here, I say there's no going back. And I think that speaks to what Armine was suggesting, that we can do more of the same or we can do better. And this is a time that really calls on us to do better. And I hope to share that early childhood educators in the early years workforce are calling on us to do better as well. So I'll start with a quick update on a recent survey that the AECEO, along with the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare, ran just this year, February and March. And we were, it was a short survey. We had about 2,000 respondents, but we just wanted to get a quick sense of where folks were at, what were their experiences like, what challenges were they facing, maybe unique ones or maybe older ones, but in different ways. Obviously, the things you're seeing on the slide here are not new challenges for the workforce, but I think the rate to which early childhood educators, childcare staff, childcare providers were identifying them is certainly increasing. We saw 54% report decreased job satisfaction, 89% reported an increase in job-related stress. The next figure is quite alarming. 43% reported they'd considered leaving the sector since the onset of the pandemic. Given what Armine just said about our need to recruit more early childhood educators, this is a really concerning figure that identifies for us we have a retention challenge, an urgent retention challenge that needs to be addressed as well. 13% of respondents said they were actively looking for opportunities outside of the sector. And this is again, since the onset of the pandemic. 20% have seen their work hours increase, but only just under 10% of those have reported a similar increase in wages. And 36% have reported a decrease in planning time. And again, these challenges aren't new challenges, but what this is telling us is that they're becoming increasingly bigger problems for our workforce. And there's something we really need to make sure we address as we're moving forward. This slide here, I'm just going to pause for a moment because I want to give space and offer gratitude to all the early childhood educators and childcare workers who shared with us. You'll see on this slide their words, their voices, articulating what this has been like. And while those statistics were quite telling, so are these comments. So I'm just going to pause for a moment and let folks take in what resonates with them. As you can see, these aren't good news stories, right? Folks are talking about depression. They're talking about increased anxiety. They're talking about time away from children. They're talking about a lack of time to do pedagogical work. They're talking about too much time sanitizing and cleaning. They're talking about leaving work every single day, feeling exhausted, hopeless, frustrated, and emotional. This is the crisis we need to address immediately. There is going to be no system and there cannot be any expansion if we don't listen to these voices and make sure that we're doing better. And the experiences that early childhood educators are having are not tied to singular problems that we can really easily identify. This is an entangled web of problems. We have a market system that perpetuates and entrenches inequities, individualism, technical approaches and efficiencies. We have an ongoing care and education divide that contributes to persistent devaluing of care and caring. We have the centering and dominance of colonialism, whiteness, developmentalism, neoliberalism. And we have policy, funding, pedagogical path dependency. I tried to make it look like a web, but I'm really bad at graphics. So this loopy line is the best I could do, but they're not separate from each other. And we can't tackle one without another. And that's what we're suggesting today. That's what I'm bringing to this conversation, is that we have to do better on all of these fronts if we're going to get a system that responds to the needs of educators, children, families, and communities. So what matters? We know that early childhood education and care is not just about affordable and safe spaces for children while parents go to work, right? Early childhood education and care is a place where educators, children, families, and communities are living and being together. They are world-making places. I still remember at the outset of the pandemic, right when childcare had reopened, and folks were sharing from across the sector what it was like to be in those programs. And someone tweeted something that was so powerful. They said, the childcare is not a human storage facility. And I think we really need to remind ourselves of that often and frequently, because too frequently, children, the pedagogical experiences they're having in programs, educators are left out of the conversation. They're not centered. And it's because of them that these spaces are meaningful. It's for them that these spaces are important. Certainly, of course, getting women into the workforce, addressing the CSHS, Armine, I can't, she session is important, but it's not sufficient. And it's not all there is that matters about early childhood education and care. And we have to remind ourselves too that these are political and ethical spaces. And Armine indicated to this in her work as well. Who is included? Where are the spaces? Who is able to live well in these spaces in our communities? How do we respond and engage and care for one another? And this idea of care, it's so fundamental, right? If we think about Joan Fronto's definition of care, right? It's about what makes living in a world well together possible. It's the foundation of what we need in societies and in this world. And we also have to think about what our pedagogy does. What do we do? What does it create? What becomes possible? And I think in thinking about what's next with the federal plan, we need to think about a federal plan that's going to bring what matters to the core. And the challenge we're up against is that this, decades of reliance on market-based arrangements and path dependencies could leave our governments to just tinker around the edges rather than make big changes. We see this time and time again with workforce issues in particular, the system, of course, the wage enhancement grant in Ontario, tinkering around the edges, the apprenticeship program, tinkering around the edges, right? Centers of excellence, tinkering around the edges. We need something that's more comprehensive, that's robust, that's transformative, and that brings everything together under this publicly funded, meaningful system. So this is the opportunity, right? There is no going back. We should not go back to the status quo. Federal funding could more than double Ontario's current childcare budget, and it aims to publicly fund services directly. And that's really important. It's on that lever, it's under that everything else becomes possible. And in our thinking about what comes next, we're really grounding what we hope to see in three key ideas, three big ideas, three core values. We want affordable fees, we want decent work, and we want enough public and nonprofit spaces for all. I'm going to talk particularly about decent work in the next couple slides, but I do just want to give an idea of the work that's happening right now in Ontario. So the AECEO and the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare are working on a path-breaking plan for childcare. And it involves three key levers, right? An affordability strategy, a workforce strategy, and a system building and expansion strategy. What's missing from this graphic, again, forgive my tech skills, is something that indicates that these three things are not separate. They are also interconnected. We need to be addressing them all together through public funding directly to services. So when we think about decent work for Ontario's early childhood workforce, we always go back to the Ontario Early Childhood Sector Decent Work Charter, which maybe many of you have seen a number of times. It's in every slide deck the AECEO ever uses. But this is the heart of the work that we do. And it was created with the heart of the system, right? This was created by early childhood educators. We did community forums across the province, and we got together and we talked about what does decent work look like? How can we imagine our workspaces differently? And then we thought, hey, let's use how does learning happen to put it in a frame that everyone in our sector responds to and understands. So you'll see at the core is decent work. But what does that look like? Broadly, it looks like belonging, being recognized as a valued professional. It means well-being, having professional pay and compensation. And it means engagement, opportunities for professional learning, and expression, quality work environments. Without this, without all of these components, we suggest that we're never really going to see the true value of early childhood programs. This is what makes pedagogical work possible. This is what makes what matters central. And so any plan we have moving forward has to provide this for early childhood educators in the childcare workforce. But specifically, what are we talking about? And given that I was supposed to talk for 10 minutes, I don't know how far along I am. I'm gonna have a sip of water, sorry. I only included a few to sort of indicate where we're going. The first one is about a wage grid or a salary grid, better called a salary grid. And this, we would ask, ensures that no one working in our sector makes under $25 an hour. Our second point, we need to develop and establish decent work standards to support pedagogical practice. And we need these decent work standards to align with our decent work charter. And they must include the provision of daily, collaborative, on-site paid planning time, and a similar model that responds to the contexts for licensed home childcare providers who are often working in isolation and don't have the same opportunities to collaborate with their colleagues. We need permanent paid sick days and emergency leave days. We need ongoing engagement in communities of practice that respond to, recognize, and respect local issues and global issues. We need paid time for professional learning. And to bring sort of all of this together, we really need an early childhood workforce learning framework that ensures that our professional learning opportunities are meaningful, that mandates anti-racism training, commits to truth and reconciliation, and enhances pathways for acquiring and upgrading qualifications, and does this in an intentional way. I've been having these amazing conversations with Inuit educators who are moving all around Ottawa. It's a growing community, but to find an Inuit ECE is incredibly challenging. We're never going to have culturally led programs if we can't find educators who grew up living and being in their communities. So we have to think differently about how we're bringing educators into this field. And we're calling on the federal, provincial government, and our local governments to form standing advisory committees that include representatives of the early childhood workforce, including Black, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and racialized educators to coordinate and inform policy development. Educators are not at the policy table. And this is the biggest mistake we're making. As you can see, their stories, their experiences, and their narratives tell us the challenges we're up against. And we have to listen to them to get it right. So what are we doing with these three big ideas? I'll be quick here and try and sum up. The ideas, the three big ideas, they're our values. They're what we hope to see. And the path-breaking plan will go into detail on how we're going to get there. And we're going to use this plan over and over and over again as we move through the next year. There's lots ahead of us, maybe a federal election, certainly bilateral negotiations, definitely a provincial election. And we're not going to stop asking for what we want and what we deserve until we get it. And in the process, we're going to review, we're going to respond, we're going to collaborate, we're going to connect with early childhood educators and other stakeholders to make sure that everyone's voices are included and everyone has a seat at the table. So I'll end here by just inviting everyone to get involved and to stay connected to the work that we're doing. The AECEO has communities of practice across the province right now. We have some regional communities of practice as well as a community of Black early childhood educators. And they're doing exactly this type of work already in their communities. They're doing professional learning, they're having critical conversations, they're doing reading groups, they're doing activism and advocacy, and they're connecting, they're building bridges, and they're renewing their commitment and their passion to the work they love and the work we know that they do in these spaces. And we're also having a webinar on June 15th to talk more about next steps for childcare advocacy in Ontario. We're going to introduce more about the path-breaking plan that we're working on. You'll note it's not a roadmap. It is a path-breaking plan because we have to get off the path we're on. We're going to share a toolkit for action, and we're going to talk about some local advocacy initiatives and inspire some new action that we can do collaboratively and collectively, because we are stronger together and we all need to be in this together. And I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Alana. You know, some of this I've been involved in, and you know, I always marvel at how you're able to capture the voices of the community. So powerful data, but most importantly, really powerful messages coming from the early childhood sector, from ECEs themselves. So you know, it gives us an opportunity to really understand more deeply, and for us to really, you know, pause and reflect and think about what those experiences are like. So I'm going to now turn it over to Kerry McCuaig, and we'll see what she has to say related to workforce issues.
Thank you, Bernice, and thank you to the my fellow panelists. Your presentations were not only highly informative, they were very moving, they're very beautiful. And I am honored to be on the same panel as you are, even though, you know, we're very far apart. But I'm going to talk to you today. I'm giving you a bit of a sneak preview of what's going to be in the Early Childhood Education Report, which my colleague, Dr. Misik Bari, will be sharing with you in her presentation tomorrow. So I'm going to zero in on the workforce component, and I'm also including data that we are going to include in a workforce data report, which we will be sharing later in the later this month. And I mean, one of the things, well, all of what this data tells us is that evidence should inform policymaking. And the other thing it tells us is just how fragile our starting point is when it comes to building an early learning and childcare system across Canada. Next slide. My good friend is sharing my slides for me. So let's talk about the workforce as a whole. The workforce is huge, as Armine alluded to, over 200,000 people. Most of them, these are 2020 figures, so I'm sure that the unemployment rate is much higher now, but it just gives you a, you know, an indication of just how big this workforce is and just how important. Next slide. Now there's, in terms of professionalism, and this is one of the questions that Armine asked, do we need a workforce training strategy? Well, let's look at what we have. And these are, this is data for regulated childcare. What you're seeing here is the provinces and territories, and how many qualified staff must be in ratios according to the regulations. So when you see on my far side with Newfoundland, you see two dark faces. That's really saying that 2 out of 3 staff, according to the regulations, are supposed to be qualified. And for our purposes, because qualifications vary widely across the country, is we're just looking at a sort of baseline of that a qualified staff person is somebody with at least a year's post-secondary education in ECE. So some of this even is looks even a little bit better than what you say here, even though this does not look good. So for example, in Quebec, we look at that 2 out of 3 staff are supposed to be qualified, but that only applies to their publicly managed centers, and they are not the majority. In Ontario, it applies, but only in preschool groups where there are 24 children. And we know that the majority of groups don't have 24 children, they have 2. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is that the unqualified staff. In some jurisdictions, they need to have a little bit of training, maybe a course or two, or so many hours of training. In others, they're required to have nothing, as long as they don't have a criminal record where they've abused children, or they don't have a communicable disease, they are eligible to work in this in this area. Now, this may look, again, more impressive than what it is, because when we look at those 200,000 plus people, less than 43% of them are qualified. That is, less than 43% have at least 1 year of a qualification, and that is because there is such difficulty recruiting to this sector that everybody gets a Hail Mary. Essentially, the government says, "Fine, as long as you work towards your qualification, you can be here," but nobody really follows it up. Next slide, please. So here we're talking about supervisors, and we know that supervisors and directors of early childhood programs are very, very important. I mean, they've got jobs that sort of, I can't imagine anybody having. You're the HR manager, the financial manager, you're the community outreach person, you're responsible for the pedagogy in your center, you're responsible for setting the culture in your center. These are the only provinces that you see here that have any qualifications that are greater than what the staff that they're overseeing are supposed to have. So, for example, so you can see it right there. Okay, so let's take Ontario, because many of you might be familiar with that. In order to be qualified to be a registered ECE, you have to have at least the 2-year post-secondary diploma in the field, plus 2 years experience, and then you can take on the running of $500,000 to $1 million small business. We're looking at some efforts in trying to raise the bar there with PEI in Nova Scotia, as you see, trying to ensure that their supervisors have at least an ECE degree. Next slide, please. Now, most jurisdictions, and you can see those that don't have it, require some sort of professional certification, registration, acknowledgement, certification, but don't get carried away, because in most cases that doesn't mean a lot. It means that really they check whether or not you got your 30 hours of professional development in the last 5 years, and that will allow you to retain your certification. Next slide, please. We know that unionization makes some difference in terms of the well-being of the early childhood workforce and the level of quality of care that they're able to provide. So this is, I found quite interesting when we did this study, because in the public sector, so these are these are people that work in municipal run, school board run, community college programs, where your employer is a public sector entity. And almost 100% of those workplaces are unionized. The sort of small nonprofit sector comes in next, with about 1 in 5 are unionized. But then we look at these big nonprofit agencies, the multi-site agencies and the large multi-site agencies like the OISE. These are largely not unionized, and in many cases very, very hostile to unionization. Next slide. So the all-important question of compensation, and this is looking at early childhood wages across the country, and let's be really clear here. These are the top wages for a qualified educator. So this isn't the median or the average. This is sort of the most you can make if you're going to work if you're going to work in this sector. So in most cases, you can see that this is looking at the difference in wages between the 4 early childhood education reports that we've done. And in most cases, wages have risen. In fact, one thing that provincial and territorial governments have done is put quite a bit of their public funding into raising the compensation for the workforce. But then we do see, like Saskatchewan and Alberta, for example, where in fact wages have gone down during this period. Next slide, please. So here's, I don't know if you remember, sort of the best paid workers across the country were in the Yukon. Well, that's because the Yukon puts big money into topping up the wages of their early childhood educators. And so at this, you can see that it's $12 an hour. Actually, as of April 1st of this year, the wage top up for an early childhood educator with a 2-year diploma, the wage top up went to $17.11 an hour. And when you put that on top of the minimum wage in the Yukon, it means that an early childhood educator is making over $30 an hour. And then you can see the different top ups. As Alana said, you know, Ontario with their little wage top up is pretty selfish. And the other difference between BC and Ontario and the other jurisdictions is the wage top ups varies depending on your qualification. So the more your qualifications, the more your wages are topped up, providing some financial incentive for educators to move up. 2 jurisdictions have a wage grid, and I'm going to show you Quebec's in a second. Manitoba has a wage floor. And then you're going to see, remember those jurisdictions where wages went down, Saskatchewan and Alberta? Well, they are also jurisdictions which do not target any funding to the compensation of the early childhood workforce. Next, please. So one of the things that the early education report does is compare the wages of the top paid early childhood educator with the median wage of a teacher, of an elementary school teacher. And here you see the differences in terms of, we've set the benchmark, or we worked with the provinces and territories to say that, in terms of setting wages, that an early childhood educator with a 2-year diploma should make at least 2/3 of what your elementary school educator would make. And what we see is only one jurisdiction reaches that bar, and that is Quebec. But we also see that in many jurisdictions, so it's the dark purple line, so that's the 2020 wages, that compared to teachers, ECE wages have actually dropped. Next slide, please. So we're often criticized for, it's silly to compare, ECEs to teachers because, they're not the same thing. I don't really know why they're not the same thing, but let's say they're not. So let's look at ECE earnings for compared to jobs that are non-STEM, requiring the same level of post-secondary education. So we looked at people who work in community service, in the legal profession, social and community service workers, people who work with persons with disabilities, etc. So even when we compare early childhood educators to these other groups, which are very much like us, have the same level of education and do very similar work, we are still coming, early childhood educators are still coming very much behind. Next. So here we've looked before at the difference in wages by province and territories, but really what is a more defining factor of how much you're going to be paid is who you work for, is the auspice of the organization that you work for. So the first you see that, so this is for the gold is our early childhood educators. The green are childcare aides and assistants. And we see that the public sector is by far the most, I don't want to use the word generous, but I can't think of another word. You know, you're more likely to be paid better if you work for a public employer than you are if you work for any other. Unionization, as you can see, helps a little bit, but this is what I think we have to come to terms with in our sector, because we're quite tied to the nonprofit sector, but the nonprofit sector isn't particularly a great employer when it comes to the early childhood workforce, because even multi-site agencies, even large multi-site agencies, which should be able to use their economy of scales in order to transfer funding towards their workers, don't. So that we actually see that the nonprofit sector pays even slightly less than what the commercial sector does. Next slide, please. And here's kind of the reason why. Yesterday or the day before, Karen Gray was saying, well, 80% of a center's budget goes on the workforce. Well, not so much as we see here, because the bar over is the 80% mark, and we see that wages, which are the red, and benefits, which are the gold, really only make it to that 80% mark in the public sector, in some unionized programs, and in sort of nonprofit sectors, which are similar to the public sector. So here again, even though we see large nonprofit organizations which have an opportunity to use their economy of scale in order to bulk buy and streamline services and put in an infrastructure, they're still paying much more on administration and other expenses than what the public sector is. Next, please. And when it comes, so the all big question of retention. So I'm giving, happens to be a slide which depicts the staying power of early childhood educators who are working for this in childcare centers in the city of Toronto. And we use Toronto because it has a very long history of providing childcare. We may, in time, see similar outcomes from educators who are working in schools, but there's not as long a history. So anyways, Toronto's children's centers have been around since the Second World War, and it looks as if some of their workforce has been along almost as long. So you see the red is the supervisors, and on average, the average length of time for a supervisor in her position is 27 years. For an early childhood educator, it's more than 10 years. And those who have been around the longest have been along for a very long time. There's very little turnover in Toronto's children's services. If people move, they move between centers. They don't move out of the sector. Next slide, please. So respect, and this is, and what I'm showing you here is sort of a compilation of a number of surveys, much like the one that Alana told you that talked about on Ontario. But we looked at surveys of early childhood educators from across the country, and these are sort of the meta-analysis of what some of the takeaways are. So Alana mentioned it. A lot of unpaid work, right? So they don't get recognized for staying over to talk to parents, or for doing consultation with parents, or for cleaning up the center, or preparing for the fundraiser, all those things that they do. And they regularly take work home and work from home, which they're not paid for. And their employers admit that they do not pay their staff. Very few offer their staff paid preparation time. And the paid preparation time, if they do offer it, does not meet the actual amount of time that educators spend doing it. Next slide, please. And as a result, 82% of employers report finding trouble recruiting and retaining qualified staff. And they have had to, and they're dealing with vacancies. And this is where we go back to, it's not only, so we're running programs right now, not only with less that, fewer qualified staff than what the regulations call for, but we're also running them without sufficient staff. And again, centers get Hail Marys on this all the time. Next. So in terms of how staff feel, about 22% thought, this is in regulated childcare, about 22% felt their wages were fair. Over 2/3 thought they did not reflect their work. And then this particular study I found interesting because it was asking early childhood educators, so they're still working in childcare, but they left their last job, or they left a job and they returned to childcare. So you can see almost a 19% left because they thought there was no place for them to go. Over 1/3 didn't like the culture, the quality of the center. They felt that they didn't want to be involved in providing such poor quality care. And this was quite interesting because ECEs really struggle, feeling like, well, if I leave, what's going to happen to these kids? But yet you still have 1/3 who left because they didn't feel that the care that was being provided was of high enough quality to meet, sort of the children's basic rights. Many left because of poor management, and we go back to those supervisors who come into this very important job with almost no training, yet they get, yet they have to, be the pedagogical leader and manage human resources, and those are different skill sets. So it's not surprising that poor management would be a reason for leaving. And then we saw many educators who look after other people's kids are unable to get their own children into childcare, and they leave the sector in order to parent their own small children. Next one. So what we do know is that when the wages are good, when wages and working conditions are good, people come back to the sector. So, and also that educators are loyal. They're very loyal to the sector. So, I mean, why else would we have half of the 53,000 educators who are registered with the College of ECEs yet don't work in the sector, but they still feel this affinity to their profession? But when Nova Scotia rolled out universal pre-primary, which is like junior kindergarten, they recruited half of their workforce who were ECEs who had left the sector or often left the province to go looking for work, and then came home in order to take the jobs because they were good jobs. Next. And that's it. So that makes it easy to end right there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wow, Kerry, so much information, so much to absorb. That was really helpful. I feel like I have a deeper understanding after listening to the three of you, the economists, the policy analyst, the activist. Different perspectives, and yet I could see a lot of synergy. You could see a lot of commonality as we learn more about workforce issues. So I will take some of the questions that we have from the audience and see where we land. One of the questions is related to, when you think about, and all of you kind of touched on the workforce and educators leaving, educators, retention being an issue, recruitment being an issue. So what's the biggest influencer behind educators leaving the childcare workforce? And perhaps we'll start with Alana. And
sure.
Then,
yeah, shall I? Sure.
Yes.
So, it's an interesting question because I would say it's hard to determine one sole factor. Like what Kerry just presented about the different reasons are very interesting. I can certainly say that what we hear from early childhood educators, childcare workers, and providers in Ontario is absolutely wages of working conditions. If you can't afford childcare of your own, if you're working a second job, it's not a sustainable option, right? If it's not a living wage, if it's not decent work, that's a main driver. But as Kerry indicated, there's a lot of other factors as well, right? We've been considering the role of what we're calling pedagogical security, which is probably connected to culture and quality, right? It's about the ability for early childhood educators to do pedagogical work in programs with children. And often we hear from educators when they're not able to do that, or they feel like their voices aren't heard and they're not respected and their work isn't valued, that can also drive them out of the sector. So I would say wages, working conditions, absolutely, and also respect. The respect and recognition for their work is huge.
Thank you. I'll go to Armine and ask her to weigh in, and then we'll go to Kerry.
I mean, I have to admit that I went down to get a glass of water when you posed your question. So I do not know what the question is.
Okay, the question is, what is the single biggest influencer behind educators leaving the childcare workforce?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I got nothing to add to what Alana and Kerry have been saying. Like nothing. I guess the meta issue is how we value people.
Yes, thank you. Kerry, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's all, you know, RECE. It's because everything else grows off that. We don't respect you, therefore we don't pay you well. We don't give you a good working environment. We don't, you know, we don't consider your training to be, you know, special and valid. So I think, you know, whether it was a survey that the AECEO developed or what we're finding in surveys across the country, you know, in the back of it, it's a job that's not respected.
I wonder, Bernice, if I can add to that too. I'm just thinking, you know, a really clear example of this in the last year has been this like narrative about the work of early childhood educators being essential, or childcare being essential. And again, I'll go back to what I sort of talked about in my presentation. We're saying it's essential, but we're putting it only in this economic context. We're saying you're essential because you go to work and you allow other people to go to work. Yet we're not providing you the conditions to do what truly, if you asked an educator, makes their work essential. They're not recognized for that. And when we talk about recognition, that can be hard to define, but I think that's a clear example. And, you know, over the last year, we, you know, ran a campaign for early childhood educators and childcare workers to have pandemic pay. You know, they worked through every lockdown since last April when they reopened, or I guess it was, I can't even remember now, May, June, but they remained open through every other lockdown and closure. So we're saying you're essential, but you're not essential enough. You're not valuable enough that we're going to care for you as a government. We're not going to provide you what you need to be well, to live well, to do the work that you mean to do. And we're not going to think about your work or value your work for what it creates with children and families and communities, only what it creates for the economy. And that's I think at the heart of the problem too.
And Bernice, if I could add something about the wage issue, because I think that Quebec gives a very interesting example here. So you have an established program, and in the Center for you know, in the publicly managed CPAs, educators make, you know, sort of the median wage in Quebec. Yet the government is working with the CPA Association to recruit 1,100 educators. That's the vacancy rate in CPAs. They can't expand them. They want to expand the number of CPAs because they're concerned about the for-profit growth, but they can't find the educators to work in these programs, even though they're some of the best in the country. So when some of the best in the country aren't good enough to keep their workers in it, it speaks to just what a fragile starting point we're in.
So what's the answer? How do we retain ECs? So I feel like you opened that up, so I had to walk in the door.
Well, you know, I think that the data is showing it. Like, I mean, who doesn't have trouble recruiting ECEs? The public sector, you know, and it's not just the pay, it's that the public sector comes with, you know, a wraparound, program which allows you to do your work better. You know, you have access to training, you have access to social workers, you have access, you know, if you need mental health support, you get it. You're not, you know, somebody else cleans the toilets. Just those, you're not responsible for running around going after parents for their fees. I mean, all of the kind of indignities that are placed on early childhood educators in many, in many programs, by and large, don't exist in the public sector.
Armine, thank you, Kerry. Armine wants to weigh in, and then we got a few more questions. I want to make sure that we get through those from the audience as well.
Yes, thank you. I think the important thing is to integrate early learning with childcare, because if we do not do that effectively, there are too many people that view what is happening as babysitting. And I think it is that understanding that we are talking about early learning and childcare, even having that language in the budget, you know, just starting that conversation when people start seeing it as educating down, educating our youngest learners, helping them to become learning ready when they enter school and learning supported as they go through school, something happens in the conversation, even with people that don't like kids or don't think that we need to be paying for other people's kids. So, there is this real antipathy for some people to pay for somebody else's babysitting. So there's a kind of cultural framing of it that might be very helpful and speaks to all of the issues that both Kerry and Alana have raised.
Yes, I would agree with that. And so this is a segue into the next question, which I think I'm going to ask Alana to start with. Is there any sense that the voices of parents and guardians are supporting the recognition of the professional nature of early child education and care? Specifically, the question is, parents demanding quality early childhood education and care.
That's such an important question, and on so many levels. Like, I think I'd like to start by acknowledging that, one of the biggest problems we have right now in our system and with the market approach is that it pits the needs of parents and educators directly against each other, right? In order for educators' wages to go up, we have to see parent fees go up, and that's part of the problem. Certainly, we've heard in the last year, and I would say an increase in recognition of the work that early childhood educators are doing. But I think, just like Armine was saying, we have a challenge ahead of us in terms of kind of reconceptualizing the way that the work is understood. When we talk about quality, of course, there's structural factors. And one of the things I was going to comment in terms of what do we do is look at ratios. One of the things we heard from early childhood educators working in emergency childcare or in the first phase of reopening was how wonderful those low ratios were. What was possible with one less child in the room per educator, right? How much more time they had to be with children and to do pedagogical work. And I think, making it really clear and transparent that when we talk about quality, for the most part, we are talking about these interactions, the caring interactions between the educators and the children. That's what makes learning possible. That's what makes these spaces meaningful. So I think parents more now than ever understand the value of childcare. But again, we struggle with this, the value of childcare as an economic support versus the value of childcare as a meaningful place for children, families, and communities. So I think we have some work to do around that.
Thanks, Alana. Armine, do you want to respond to any of that?
Yeah, sure. I think when a sector of the economy is as big as the care economy, which has good paying jobs and bad paying jobs in it. Look, we are in a moment where we are about to enter 25 to 30 years of the largest cohort in history of people on fixed and low incomes who cannot work to make more money are coming on stream. That's what it means to have a society where 1 in 4 people is going to be over the age of 65. There is going to be widespread resistance. You're already hearing the inflation hawks lose their shit over, how big is the deficit? How much are we borrowing? How much are we spending? Will we be able to afford the debt, the public debt, like blah, 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 inflation. Wait till the boomers get on it. The boomers will not want to see any price increases because their incomes won't increase. And they are a very vocal and active lobby group. And so we are going to be seeing a lot more tension in society where we're pitting ourselves as consumers against ourselves as workers, right? We need the care, we need it to be cheap. But we want to make good money, but oh no, I don't want to pay the good money. It's the same thing as wanting to buy a $5 t-shirt. Everybody wants the deal. The flip side of every deal is a crummy wage and working condition for somebody, right? So this is not a new conversation. It is going to get worse because of the role of people needing to go to work and not being able to afford much to take care of the people that are too old, too young, or too sick to work that are in their midst. So until we start framing what the care economy is about, move it away from the economic part, like it is an economic driver, but that's where the money is to be made. Right? So it's going to be a struggle. We are not going to get through this easily or quickly unless we demarketize the sector. And that is going to be an even bigger political struggle than any of the rest of it, because we've had 40 years of more market, less government. So it's going to be a fight. I mean, we might be able to win it, but it is going to be a fight.
Yeah, I can hear that tension between being an economic driver and then respecting the work. Kerry, yes, you wanted to weigh in on this.
Well, just picking up on Armine's point about the commercialization of childcare. In 7 out of 13 jurisdictions, the commercial sector dominates. It has more than 50%. Of the $7 billion that were spent in 2020 on regulated childcare, $3 billion went to commercial operators. And those same corporate entities that are running long-term care homes are now sniffing around the potential of expanding into childcare. And they are, and they are powerful. We know how powerful they are because they murdered thousands of people and they're not paying for it in any, in any kind of way. And the reason that they were able to be that powerful and devastate, the devastation that they wreaked in long-term care homes was because they have big access to public money. Most of the funding for long-term care homes comes from public money, public pensions. And, and this is the, this is the specter that we are looking at. So yes, on one hand, atta girls, we got that $30 billion in the budget, but if it's spent wrong, it can do a lot of damage.
Damn straight. Damn straight.
Thank you for that. All right, another question. Again, I'll just read it. In many fields that are mostly dominated by women, there has been a history of concerns about respect for their work as demonstrated in salaries, job security, educational expectations, etc. Unions remedied these issues. Do you think it would be helpful for early child educators to unionize before the national system is established in order to ensure these issues are addressed from the beginning? So why don't we start with Kerry, and then we'll go to Armine and then Alana.
I think that there is no doubt that that unionization is of value to the early childhood, workforce. and it's not just because, they get to, negotiate, a few more cents an hour, because as Alana said, when unions negotiate, they're negotiating against parents, who then have to, pay higher fees. But what unions can do is is a great force for advocacy. And that, I think, is gives early childhood educators a space and a place, and the knowledge that unions have in how to mobilize and advocate for their rights.
I think we're leading with our chin if we go that direction, by trying to unionize everybody first. I think everything that Kerry showed us in her doc said that if you work in a public sector place that provides care, you're going to be treated with more respect because you're almost automatically unionized. So I think the strategy should be for greater unionization, but through more public provision of early learning and childcare, integrated with the other public supports that are called education and other forms of infrastructure. I think we need to not only frame this sector as early learning and childcare, not just childcare, not just early childhood educators. Maybe that is the right word, I don't know, but I think leading with the early learning part of the early learning and childcare is really helpful, and integrating the idea of early learning and childcare as being part of social infrastructure that should be public, that should not be market driven as we expand it. And the sidecar to that is better unionization. I mean, I think we're going to get more unionization of all sorts of workplaces anyway. I think workers are going to be so hard to find, to recruit and retain, that it will be, we're already seeing a rise in unionization in some of the lowest paid workers, and a lot more focus on labor rights and organizing than we have seen in my professional lifetime, which is a long stretch of time. And I think it's because we're moving from 45, 50 years of labor surplus to an era of widespread labor shortages. The population aging chart I showed you in my deck means that we will have widespread labor and skill shortages, and that shifts bargaining power. So I think there will be more ability and desire of workers to demand more and better. But I think a really low-hanging fruit way of getting more people with better representation is by shifting as much of this sector as possible into a definition of social infrastructure that happens to be, like education and health, good for us all. So I think there's just a faster way of doing it than organizing individual workplaces, though. It'd be nice if that happened. It just wouldn't necessarily deliver the goods.
Alana.
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Bernice. I think, I won't echo what's already been said, but just to acknowledge, union density in the childcare sector is incredibly low. Should early childhood educators be unionized or have access to collective bargaining? Of course. Is it realistic that that will get done before a Canada-wide childcare system is developed? Hard to say. Like, if bilateral negotiations are starting in a month, I mean, the clock is ticking. And as Armine indicated, the way the system is right now, it's center by center by center, because there's not a unified employer, because it is parent fees and nonprofit boards who will be responsible to the employees. So I think there's challenges to getting there, but I think it's something that has to be a part of the vision of what we want to see as part of a Canada-wide childcare system. Absolutely.
So a similar question. There's a couple. One is, I'm curious about your points of view on how dominantly held view or the value of childhood is potentially a structure that holds up dominant view of early years educator work. How might reconceptualization of childhood interrupt lack of respect, et cetera, of the work of the early years educators? And then, there's a question about the use of the term child care workers in and of itself. So why don't we start with you, Alana, and then we'll go to Armine and then Kerry.
I'm trying to, that was a big question. I'm just trying to.
I can repeat it.
I'll start with the speaking to terminology. Certainly in Ontario, of course, as most of you know, I'm sure, we have early childhood educators. It's a protected title. But then, as we also know, there are many people working in our sector who are not early childhood educators. But they are important to these spaces, and they are part of the system that we want to grow. So, you know, calling them a childcare worker, I think there's a critical question about like why the term worker is often seen as being problematic. I mean, work isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think it makes space for those who are non-qualified staff in our work to really include them as childcare workers or early years staff. But for many, they don't identify as early years staff if they're not working in program with young children. And the dominantly held value of childhood that holds up views of the work of educators. I mean, I think these things are intrinsically connected, right? The devaluing of childhood, the devaluing of care, the devaluing of women's work. This is all things that, you know, 50 years ago were purely in the private sector, right? Or were done in the home, maybe 60 years ago now, forgive my math. But as they've become public spaces, our narratives haven't shifted to see them as part of society, a valuable part of society, right? Children are not just about their outcomes and not just about what they'll be doing once they hit public education. They're important and valuable where they are right now, as is the work of early childhood educators. So I think we start to interrupt them in the way we're doing right now by having this conversation, by bringing educators, children and families into policy discussions and into visioning what we want childcare to look like. I think it's about including people in the conversation as a starting point.
I think you were going to go next, Armine, if you wanted to weigh in on this. And then
sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So it was a loaded question. I'm not sure I fully got it. But if we're talking about dominant ways of describing a sector, that's essentially what this conversation is about. Right from the beginning with the video that you played about the land recognition, is what is our relationship with others? We are redefining that. We've gone through the looking glass with the pandemic. So much of what we take for granted has been questioned. How we will get through it, maybe it's like a mass shooting, you know, maybe there'll be a lot of thoughts and prayers and we'll just go back to doing what we always have done. But maybe things will actually change. And it's that idea of a dominant narrative about what childhood is and who takes care of kids, as Alana said, has been around for 60 years. And that narrative has been about choice. It's your choice if you want to have a baby or not. It's your choice if you want to work when you have a baby. Oh, you want to work and you want to have a baby? Well, it's your choice, whatever kind of childcare you want to find. It's not up to me to take care of you. It has been a very libertarian couple of generations, and it has been women's work that has always carried us through, paid and unpaid. But that blue and gray chart I showed you, the population aging chart, is going to force us to think about how we're all in this together, that we are going to be so reliant on a shrinking cohort of working age people who are taking care of those who are too old, too young, and too sick to work, that we're going to have to start looking very differently about what do we mean by this work, by the caring work. I think we're going to decommodify the sector, but it's going to be, you know, a fight. And it will change the narrative of why we're here and who we're here for, what governments are for, who governments are for. You know, what's the difference between the market and the rest of our lives? That's the conversation we're going to be having. And it's going to be a difficult one for a lot of people who just can't get past them, you know, what they've always seen. But we've left it. We've left what we have lived through for the last 40 or 50 years. The pandemic forced us to leave it, and population aging is going to force us to realize we can't go back to normal. There is no normal to go back to. The pandemic poured accelerant on something that was going to happen anyway because of population aging. So we're going to have to look at how we interact with one another and our relationship to paid work and how we rely on people to help us do the things we need to do, both paid and unpaid. It's all going to change, baby. It's all going to change.
Kerry, did you want to respond to any of this?
I just to say that one of the things that the pandemic showed was how much childcare that schools did. The other thing it showed was just how important schools were as a place for children, and the absence of having that space, the impact it had on children's mental health. So it goes back to a point Alana was making, is that childcare, that early childhood education centers are more than a place to, you had a beautiful line, Alana, I forget it, you'll have to post it, are more than storage facilities for kids. They are a space and a place for community. They are that special place, just like schools, that special place where you get to go to when you're, in kindergarten. Your first experience and ongoing with your child care program should mirror that. So it's wrapped up. Our lack of respect for the people who do this work is mirrored in the lack of respect for young children. And I think that this is where our focus should be. This is why they need to be really good programs. And what we're offering them right now isn't good enough.
Thanks, Kerry. So I'm going to leave it with you because one of the questions that came up that I think kind of fits here is how can we have governments, city planners be encouraged to include early child educators in future planning of urban centers?
Can I take a run at that?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, please.
So
yes.
we've kind of been dazzled by the $30 billion over 5 years federal money for early learning and childcare. But prior to that, we had hundreds of billions of dollars dedicated to infrastructure builds, public infrastructure builds. And so I think sliding the frame about what we're doing into what is it that we're building? We're repairing what our parents built. We are building and expanding public assets and structures. And the idea that the infrastructure can be built to create what we need, and like the physical infrastructure intersects with the care actually that takes place in those places. We're not doing a good enough job of running with that. I think that'll really help us to root and absolutely deep root this sector. There's a lot of cities all over, a lot of towns all over Canada that are depopulating because of aging. And as cities depopulate, the care sector becomes more and more important. It becomes more and more the anchor of the economy that continues to remain, because people need care, people need services, and those services need to be publicly provided, or too many people won't get them at all. So I think there is, again, a transitional moment here about understanding how infrastructure intersects with the work that you are doing, and how much money is there, and how much we could actually be building in early learning and childcare in so many projects that are underway right now. In fact, that has been a discussion for a bunch of people saying, why isn't part of the RFP for any publicly funded infrastructure project, including a tranche on how are we dealing with the children of the workers that are doing it? What's your childcare answer? Sometimes it might be hard built and last for a long time. Sometimes it could be just making sure that there is childcare available for the people that are doing the work, finding a way of subsidizing that care. Anyway, I think you can get that money. That is the biggest single investment in the economy that we will have seen since the 60s. And it is going to be our money, public funding, not business investment, that is going to, like, it's baked into budgets at the federal and provincial level for years to come for a 10-year profile. Like, we should be making that money do double and triple duty for us.
If I can add to that, I think I'd like to speak to, how in particular, what are some ways we can bring early childhood educators and childcare workers and families to these conversations? Because I think that is a big missing link. And part of the work we're trying to do with the AECEO is continue to disrupt this sort of barrier that excludes their voices from policy, funding, dialogues, and spaces. And, I've heard just in the last 2 weeks of great initiatives, one in Ottawa at Andrew Fleck, one in London Bridge and Sarnia, of educators collaborating on builds, collaborating on playground construction. I think we need to think differently about what our outcome will be and stop looking to models we already have and start looking to communities for what's best for them, what meets the needs of their community. And in terms of, I think the question asked about how do we convince people that they need to be there. And one thing we continue to do is just bring them anyway, whether people want them in the conversation or not. So I think there's something to that too, right? There's nothing for them without them. And that goes for children, and it goes for educators, and it goes for families. So we have to demand different of decision makers as well, and say there needs to be a seat at the table for folks. If we're going to, again, have something that's responsive, that's contextual, that's locally driven, and is really changing, breaking the path we're on. So I would say it's about those of us who have access to these spaces, those of us who are in more privileged, powerful positions, if you will, to make those gaps, to make those disruptions, and to bring them with us and demand no less.
Kerry, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, there are good examples across the country of where public policy has really helped to expand nice spaces for kids. So like rules that any new school build or major renovation must have a childcare center in it. Vancouver, the city of Vancouver and the city of Toronto used to have a policy that, that any major construction had to, major office construction had to, put aside space for childcare. I think that this is important because I do not want to see the money, which Armine makes a very good point about, is not that much. I don't want to see it spent on opening childcare up in strip malls, or saving our churches by renting out their space, renting out their basements for childcare programs. I mean, we need real spaces that are kid-centered spaces. And not to make it so hard for parents so that they're running all around town, dropping one kid off here and another kid off there. There is a reason why schools are natural places for young children to be, and really thinking about it as the first tier of education. We have elementary school, secondary school. For our youngest, we need to think about the first tier of education.
Do you think that's true in all communities?
Well, the thing is, every community has a school. Every kid has a right to get to school, right? So in most cases, and often that is the only space that there is. I've been in lots of remote parts of Canada, and the one public building that there is the school. And so are you going to begin, start a whole new infrastructure of something different? Are you going to build on to what the public already owns, to what already is a child's space?
I might add to this conversation, if I may, and just share a personal narrative. I live in a childcare desert. So when you look at that CCPA report, you'll see my postal code right there, where there's no licensed childcare in my community. And when I was going back to work, my daughter was 6 months. And so I was looking for childcare. We had just moved to a rural community. and there was no options. So I started looking at unlicensed home childcare. It was the only thing in my neighborhood. And the first house that I went to, the provider, refused to give me a tour of her home. When I asked about feeding practices, she didn't have a high chair. She only had a recliner bouncy chair, and she thought it was okay to feed my 6-month-old daughter in a reclined position. And I thought, this is not a choice. This is not a choice I want to make. This is no choice a parent should have to make about whether can I go back to work or leave my child here. The problem in my community is the school's full and there's nowhere to build. So I think, yeah, schools are important places in our communities, but we also have to think differently about what's possible, because it's not going to meet needs for everyone. This can't be the biggest critique we're hearing from the right now is that this is a one size fits all institutional approach to childcare, and it's not, and it can't be, because it's not going to work where I live, and it's not going to work where so many others live. And we need to create a system that removes this completely unjust and unfair choice for families and provides real alternatives that are high quality and that offer solutions that, like I said, are community driven. And I think that's why we need to think locally about how we're including those voices in building the system and imagining what's actually possible.
I have to weigh in here. I couldn't agree with Alana more. And I must say that we are underutilizing the public assets that we have. So both and, not either or.
And I don't, sorry, if I could just add this, I don't think we should buy into, we don't want cookie cutter. We do want cookie cutter. We want across the country, our early childhood programs to look nice. We want them to be nice places for kids. We want them to be staffed by people who are happy to be there and are supported in the work that they do. I want them to look very much the same, right? Just like when, if I moved from St. John's, Newfoundland with my kid in grade 2 and took him out to Victoria, his school, would look pretty much the same. His curriculum would look pretty much the same, and his teacher would have the same sort of qualification. What is there about small kids that we think that, because they live in a different city, they need something different? We really should not buy into this garbage about cookie cutters.
Yeah, but the cookie cutter is not about the quality of care, I don't think, as much as, does it always have to be in a school? Does it always have to be nonprofit? Like it's the building, and it's the commercialization versus not commercialization that particularly those who do not want governments to be spending this money because they want their tax cuts. That, it isn't just right wing, it's just people that actually don't care about anybody else and want their money. And they don't want their money spent on something that they don't think is going to work for reasons like Alana gave. It's like, my school is full, so what are you going to do? Build another whole new building? I think these are really difficult questions. I agree with you on the quality of care. We want it to look the same. Roughly, schools are going to look the same. Are schools the only place that care can happen? No. Are schools being utilized to their full potential? No. So let's just get over ourselves and create better care that isn't driven by commercial dynamics. That's what I'm most scared of, is the commercial dynamics. That when you have a childcare desert and public funding, there's some crappy program that has decided, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to milk it for what it's worth. And if it doesn't work, I still make a lot of money. It's like, that would be the worst.
And I think too, Armine, to your point, and I apologize if I start freezing, I can see my internet cables or connections unstable, but we're never gonna have, right now we're talking about mainstream childcare. We're not even talking about Indigenous-led childcare, yep. Right? We're not even talking about childcare for newcomer families and communities. We're not talking about that, and that's part of the problem. Cookie cutter, like you say, yeah, it's that commercialized, institutionalized approach, but like cookie cutter, we also need to think about whose childcare, What does childcare look like for them? What matters in their communities, for their families, for their children? Because that's going to show us, again, just like I say with educators' voices, if we're listening to people, we're going to be able to identify the problems we have to face. So I think, yeah, it's about, we need that standard of quality. We need those assurances that these are good spaces for children, but they need to be different. We need them to be different.
Sorry, Alana, I don't know what the difference is, right? I think that, and Amis will no doubt talk about this tomorrow. But what we see across the country is that provinces and territories are using their school systems to expand universal access to early childhood education, and they're doing it because in many parts of the country, you have happened to be in a community where your school is chock-a-block full. Many parts of the country, putting a childcare center in it is what saves the school. Are growing the school down to include 3 and 4 year olds is what saves the school and saves the community. So it's something more. It's not. I don't want to get I don't want to get branded with I'm only about schools, but I am saying that we have the one public institution that we have, which is not healthcare, because healthcare is a dog's breakfast. The one public institution that we have by and large in Canada is public education. And most parents like it, and most parents send their kids to it. So we already have an institution that has a lot of public trust. So building on that asset makes sense, rather than starting a new system and having to really replicate the same things for young children that we already have in place, for older kids. So when provinces come up with a schools first policy, which is that if you're renovating the school anyway, it's going to have a childcare center, and it's going to be a new school, it's going to have a childcare center in it. And we're also seeing that in many jurisdictions, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, for example, you don't need purpose-built space for after-school care. After all, the kid's been in it all day. Like, why do they have to go to a separate part in order to a separate gym or a separate playground example? We can also use what we have more intensely.
So I guess the one of the other questions is how do we ensure that we are capturing diverse voices? How do we make sure that there is a seat at the table for BIPOC communities, people who are not part of the typical networks, who are not connected through the regular channels? I'll start with Armine, and then Kerry, and then Alana.
I mean, that is a great question, and it goes to Alana's point about you just bring the people that live the work and live the reality of the lack of care or the need for care that is a little bit different than cookie cutter. Those people need to be brought along. So all of us on this call can lean into our own spheres of influence and recognize there are times when it isn't your voice that needs to be heard, it's somebody else's voice, or maybe it's your voice plus somebody else's voice. Bring somebody along, make it real. Even politicians, maybe politicians more than most, love an extra story, right? Arthur and Doug Ford. So like stories really stick with people. Lived experience really sticks with people. So I think it's our job individually, and as much as we can, to get used to this idea of respectful relations. Again, it goes right to the top of this conversation in that video. It's like, what's your relationship with the people around you? How much do you respect them? How much do you lift them up as much as you would like to be lifted up?
Thank you. I mean, Kerry, and then Alana.
I think if I could share an example from a survey that we did with the city of Toronto, and so City Council has a commitment to anti-Black racism training, and because childcare staff in Toronto centers are, City of Toronto employees. They all got training in anti-Black Black racism, which did two things. One is, and when we were interviewing the staff, two things happened. One is they were better able to understand and see the world through the eyes of a 4-year-old Black child in a way that they weren't able to do it before. But the other thing that they noticed is that, we don't have many Black supervisors. We don't have many, people of color who are in leadership position. The people who are interviewing people for their subsidies, largely don't look like the people who are coming and sitting in front of them. So again, it's just an example of when you have, an infrastructure which has capacity, it's an easier process to take on these kind of very important issues than you are when you're a small standalone center, where you're running as fast as you can just to keep the doors open.
Thanks, Kerry. Alana, do you want to weigh in? And then we'll take one more question. I think we're running close to the end.
This is a really big question and a really important question. And I think there's a number, Kerry, you just mentioned it, right? Like anecdotally, we know that in our sector, Black, First Nation, Métis, Inuit, racialized educators are facing more precarious working conditions. They're facing lower wages. That needs to change. We need them in leadership positions because their knowledge and experience that they bring with them is unique and offers us something and brings something else to the table, right? It helps us sort of dismantle the dominance of colonial thinking and developmentalism and start to think differently about the work that we're doing and what's happening in these spaces. And I think too, part of our work, part of the work of the AECEO and what we're trying to do is create spaces where educators can come together and have these conversations, come together and start to engage in activism and in advocacy and talk about their rights and talk about leadership and bring diverse voices together and bring them forward together and build those relationships that really sustain each other and help us, lift up someone else as much as you want to be lifted up, as Armine said. So through our communities of practice, this work is happening, right? Through the community of Black ECEs, we're bringing together Black educators, and it's about their voices coming through our policy, coming through everything we're doing and everything we're talking about, their experiences leading. And for us too, like Armine said, knowing when to step back and giving space for others to talk. I mean, Bernice, you've been on some of our calls with the ministry where we, make sure that they're heard, right? That they're able to tell their stories, that they're able to speak truth to power. And I think we all have a responsibility in leadership positions to be really disrupting the status quo and doing this work day in and day out.
Okay, great. Thank you. I did promise lively conversation. One more question. I think it's a relatively straightforward one. Do you see universal childcare accommodating shift worker parents, guardians? Would school-based early learning and care be able to accommodate this? Kerry, why don't we start with you, and then Alana, and then we'll give Armine the last word.
Well, one of the things that we know is childcare isn't everything. And part of our challenge is that good childcare has to go with good parental leave. And we know that too many parents aren't eligible for parental leave. So let's start there. The other thing is we also need workplace cultures which respect that young workers are the parents of young children. But what do we see in a lot of jobs? It's like you have to be in it for 30 years before you get day shift. So maybe we should be thinking a little bit differently. Maybe who gets day shift and maybe who gets first priority for their summer vacation, isn't the 50-year-old white guy, but it's the parent of the young child.
I like that so much, Kerry. Talk about flipping the script there. I think that's so important to think about. And I think, sorry, did I just butt in or was it? No, okay.
No, I was.
I was so excited. I think too, yeah, absolutely. Childcare, we have to make sure it's flexible. And we see, you know, there are examples of this. There, you know, in the city of Toronto, there's centers that are open till 11 p.m. There's licensed home childcare operators that offer overnight care. There are already solutions. So it's about us thinking about how we make sure that those solutions are, you know, at the heart of the system, and we're really meeting families where they're at. Again, going back to thinking locally, thinking contextually, and thinking creatively about what's possible, and not just doing status quo.
I mean,
One of our participants, Jessica from Fanshawe, said that the more we put the emphasis on education, the less we put emphasis on care, and that just kind of feeds into how we constantly devalue care, which, by the way, is unpaid work by women primarily. So maybe it's because we love them, we need them, but we devalue them. But I think, as much as I've been trying to make the case that putting more emphasis on the education side of early learning and childcare actually brings more people over that would not normally be in our camp here. And it's important to know who your audience is and who you're trying to sway. It's also really clear that our job is to put the emphasis on care in early learning and childcare. So will universal childcare, cookie cutter childcare, deal with the care needs of shift workers and children with disabilities, or special needs children, or Indigenous children, or children that are the children of refugees and traumatized by whatever it is they've been through? Yes, if the premium is on care. Yes, we can care for one another if that's our job, is to care for one another first. So what it might sound like I'm sucking and blowing at the same time, but I actually think different audiences require different emphasis. And when we're talking to one another and to others that may not be in our tent, to really remember that the moment we are in is shifting from a world that has been based on economic growth and money to a world that absolutely is slowing down in terms of economic growth. And that slowing down will help us focus more on brand new emphasis on relationship and respect for one another. So you're in a beautifully positioned place in this conversation to change the world.
what a wonderful way to end. Thank you for that, Armine. That's lovely. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you for some really engaging conversation, some really thought-provoking discussion and insights and information. I was watching, monitoring the Q&A, and some crept into the chat box. And there is an interest in accessing all of your slides. So we've let people know that they will be posted on the Atkinson Center website. So, you know, again, a lot of interest. So I'm just going to say good night and then invite participants to join tomorrow, day 4. It's our national and international lessons. We have a speaker, Geraldine Lebeur, policy officer, Early Child Education Care Commission, the European Commission. We have our Dr. Amis Akbari, who will be presenting more on the early years report. And also excited to let you know that we have Cecile Minot, Director, Consortium for Social Development and Research at the University of West Indies. So very diverse perspectives tomorrow at 10 a.m. from 10 to 12. So thank you, everyone. And it's 8:28. So we're on time, which always feels good as a moderator to be able to achieve that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bernice.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you were great.